The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor. And Kang Ji-hoon didn't even blink. He straightened his cuff, met his father's eyes, and waited. 6 months, his father said, voice shaking. 6 months to bring home a wife, or the company goes to your cousin. The door slammed. The room emptied. Ji-hoon stood alone, staring at the broken glass on the floor, watching champagne soak into the rug like spilled blood. 32 years old. Worth billions. And his entire empire hinged on a wedding ring he'd never wanted. Before we continue, I need your help. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers, and every single one matters. So if this story has you hooked already, please hit that subscribe button right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the world. And I would love to know, drop a comment and tell me, where in the world are you listening from? Whether you're in Lagos, London, Seoul, or somewhere in between, say hello. It means everything to know you're out there. Now, back to Ji-hoon. 3 weeks later, he found her. Arya and George sat across from him in a private dining room most people couldn't even get a reservation at. Posture perfect. Eyes unreadable. Wearing a simple burgundy dress that somehow made her look more put together than anyone he'd ever sat across a negotiating table from. No performance. No nerves. Just quiet confidence that filled the room without asking permission. He slid the contract across the table. This is a business arrangement. Nothing more. You need legal status and financial stability. I need a wife for appearances. 2 years, then we go our separate ways, and you receive the settlement we discussed. Arya picked up the document and read every single word. 5 full minutes of silence. He watched her. She didn't rush. Rule number 3, she said finally, her voice calm and precise. No romantic involvement of any kind. Correct. Rule number 7. Neither party interferes with the other's personal life. Correct. She set the contract down. Looked him dead in the eyes. And if either of us breaks these rules, the contract ends. The settlement is forfeited. That's what it says. She picked up the pen. When's the wedding? Ji-hoon felt something shift in his chest. He ignored it. This was business. He'd closed hundreds of deals more complicated than this. She signed, bold, unhurried, like she'd already made peace with it before she walked through the door. One question, Arya said, standing and smoothing her dress. Do you always structure your way out of problems, Mr. Kang? Always. It's efficient. Then this should be simple. She picked up her bag. I'll see you at the wedding. She left without looking back. Her heels clicked against the marble like a countdown. He told himself he didn't watch her go. He didn't find her by accident. Kang Ji-hoon didn't do anything by accident. 3 weeks after the boardroom, after the shattered glass and his father's ultimatum, he sat in his home office at midnight with a single file open on his desk. Photographs. Documents. A life reduced to bullet points by a man he paid very well to be thorough. His investigator had given him 12 candidates. He dismissed 11 before morning. 2 connected to his social circle. 2 ambitious in ways that would complicate things. 2 eager, and eagerness, in his experience, always became expensive. Then there was candidate 12. Arya and George. 28. Kenyan British. Master's degree in international business from Yonsei, graduated top of her cohort. Currently caught in a visa complication that had nothing to do with her qualifications and everything to do with paperwork and timing and the particular cruelty of bureaucratic systems that moved slowly while people's lives did not. She was working 2 contract roles to stay afloat. Both beneath her. Ji-hoon read her academic record twice. Then her professional history. Then the summary of her visa situation, which was, on paper, solvable, and which she had not yet solved, because the honest solutions required either money or time, and she was short on both. He closed the file. She's perfect. Not because she was desperate. He was precise enough with language to know the difference. She was capable and temporarily cornered, and that was an entirely different thing. Desperation made people unpredictable. Being cornered, when you were intelligent, just made you practical. He needed practical. He made the reservation for the following Tuesday. She arrived exactly on time, which he noted without expression. He'd expected composed. He hadn't expected the particular quality of her composure, the kind that didn't perform itself, didn't announce itself, just existed, steady and self-possessed, as she crossed the room and took her seat across from him without waiting to be directed. Mr. Kong. Ms. N. George. She didn't look around the restaurant. Didn't seem impressed or unsettled by it. She looked at him, which most people found difficult to do for longer than a few seconds. She ordered water and waited. He laid out the arrangement in clear, sequential terms. The timeline. The public requirements, galas, family dinners, quarterly business events. The private terms, separate bedrooms, separate schedules, no interference in each other's personal lives. The financial structure, a monthly allowance during the term, full legal residency secured within 30 days, and a settlement at the conclusion that would give her enough to go wherever she wanted and build whatever she'd been building before Korea complicated things. He slid the contract across the table when he was done. She picked it up and read it. Actually read it. Every page, every clause, every subclause. She turned back twice to cross-reference language, and once she paused and tilted her head slightly at something that clearly didn't satisfy her. Rule 11, she said without looking up. The secondary party agrees to conduct themselves in a manner consistent with the primary party's public reputation and business interests. She set the page down. That's broad. It's standard. It's vague. And vague language in contracts tends to expand in the direction of whoever has more leverage. Ji-hoon looked at her. I'll add a definition clause, he said. Specific conduct parameters. Nothing open to interpretation. She held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once and kept reading. He found himself recalibrating. He'd expected her to be sharp, her record had told him that much. He hadn't expected her to be comfortable. To sit across from a man who had just proposed purchasing 2 years of her life and treat the conversation like a negotiation between equals, because that was exactly what it was, and she clearly knew it. Most people forgot that part. She didn't. When she finished, she set the contract down with the same unhurried precision she'd applied to every page. I have one condition, she said. The terms are final. This one's simple. I keep my work. Whatever contracts I'm able to secure during the term, I fulfill them. My career doesn't pause for this arrangement. Ji-hoon considered it for exactly 3 seconds. It was reasonable. It was clean. And frankly, a wife with her own professional life asked fewer questions about his. Agreed. She picked up the pen. Signed her name in one fluid motion, bold, decisive, no hesitation. He signed beneath it. And just like that, Kang Ji-hoon had a fiancé. He told himself it felt like closing a deal. It almost did. The wedding took 11 minutes. Ji-hoon had timed it, not out of cruelty, but because he'd requested brevity and he liked to know when things went according to plan. The officiant was efficient. The vows were standard. The flowers, white peonies, chosen by his assistant, were tasteful and said nothing about either of them. Arya wore ivory silk. He noticed, in the way he noticed variables that fell outside his existing models, that she looked nothing like a woman performing a transaction. She looked like a woman who had made a decision and arrived at peace with it before the day began. Her hair was pinned up, elegant. Her expression was composed but not cold. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice, and when the officiant told him he could kiss his bride, she tilted her chin up slightly and met him halfway, brief, careful, precise, and then it was done. He felt the ghost of it for longer than made sense. Around them, the small assembly watched. His father, stiff with something between relief and suspicion. His grandmother, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. A handful of senior partners who would carry the image of this back to their offices and file it under resolved. Arya had no family present. She'd been clear about that in a tone that closed the subject without drama. At the reception, 2 hours, a sit-down dinner, nothing excessive, she worked the room in a way that shouldn't have surprised him but did. Not worked it in the calculated sense. She simply spoke to people. Asked questions and listened to the answers. His grandmother, who communicated her disapproval of most things through a refined architecture of silence and raised eyebrows, sat with Arya for 20 minutes and laughed twice. Genuinely. The sound of it turned heads. Extraordinary woman, Director Kim said at Ji-hoon's elbow, eyes following Arya across the room with open appreciation. You're a fortunate man. Ji-hoon smiled the way he smiled at quarterly projections, measured, acknowledging, revealing nothing. Thank you. His hand tightened around his glass. When it was over, they rode to the penthouse in silence. Arya looked out the window at the city lights sliding past. Ji-hoon looked at his phone. Both of them, he thought, were grateful for the quiet. 12,000 square feet. That was the size of the space that would now contain both of them, arranged in careful opposition like two weather systems that had agreed, legally, not to collide. He showed her through it himself, which he hadn't entirely planned. His housekeeper had offered. He declined without examining why. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of one of Gangnam's most coveted residential towers. Floor-to-ceiling glass. The Han River on one side, the city on the other. Everything inside was curated to within an inch of its life, muted tones, clean lines, furniture chosen for architecture rather than comfort. It was, he knew, a beautiful space. It was also, undeniably, a space that had never been lived in. Only occupied. He showed her the guest wing last. 3 rooms, private bathroom, a dressing room stocked with the wardrobe his stylist had sourced in her sizes. He opened each door in turn. This is yours, he said. I won't enter without permission. The staff will adjust to your schedule, just let Mrs. Park know your preferences. The card is in the top drawer. Use it for whatever you need within reason. Arya walked through slowly, trailing her fingertips along the edge of the dresser, the back of a chair, the cool surface of the window glass. She moved through the rooms the way she did everything, unhurried, taking stock. It's beautiful, she said. The stylist worked from the measurements you provided. If anything needs adjusting. Ji-hoon. He stopped. She was standing at the window, looking out at the river. She hadn't turned around. Do you ever actually live here? Or do you just exist in it? The question sat in the room between them. He didn't answer, because the answer was obvious and she already knew it. She turned then, and the look on her face wasn't pity. He wouldn't have tolerated pity, it was something quieter. The particular expression of someone recognizing a pattern they'd seen before. Thank you for the tour, she said. I'll be fine. He nodded once and left her to it. Walking back through the long, silent corridor toward his own wing, Ji-hoon became aware, for the first time in years, of how much empty space the penthouse actually contained. It had never bothered him before. He couldn't explain why it did now. The first 2 weeks passed like a controlled experiment. They shared the penthouse the way two planets share a solar system, governed by the same structure, moving in entirely separate orbits, close enough to exert gravity on each other and careful enough never to test it. Arya left early. Returned at reasonable hours. Ate dinner in her wing most nights, occasionally in the kitchen if she'd cooked something, and once left a portion on the counter with a small note that said there's extra if you want it, in handwriting that was neat and slightly impatient, like her thoughts moved faster than her pen. He didn't eat it. He thought about it longer than was warranted. They were courteous in the hallways. They exchanged good mornings over coffee they made separately, at different times, in the same kitchen. Once she asked him a question about a clause in a contract she was reviewing for one of her freelance clients, and he answered it, and she said thank you and went back to her laptop, and that was the longest conversation they'd had inside the apartment since the day he showed her the rooms. It was, by every metric he'd established, working perfectly. Then came the gala. The Latte Foundation's annual charity event was Seoul's most carefully attended evening of the year. Black tie. Guest list curated by people who understood that exclusivity was its own form of currency. Ji-hoon had attended every year for the past decade and found it useful in the way that most necessary things were useful, not enjoyable, exactly, but productive. He briefed Arya in the car. Guest names, affiliations, conversation territories that were safe and those that weren't. She listened with the focused attention of someone preparing for a negotiation, asked 4 questions that told him she'd already researched half the room independently, and then turned to look out the window and said nothing else. He found her silence, as always, surprisingly easy to be inside. She wore deep emerald. He registered this the way he registered a market shift, as information with implications he hadn't fully calculated yet. The gown was modest by any standard. High neckline. Long sleeves. But it moved with her in a way that made it impossible not to notice that she was the kind of woman rooms adjusted to without being asked. "You look," he started. She glanced at him. "Appropriate," he finished. Something flickered at the corner of her mouth. "So do you." Inside, it took approximately 11 minutes for the room to find her. Not because she sought attention. That was the thing he couldn't quite systematize, watching it happen from 3 feet away. She didn't perform warmth or manufacture charm. She simply engaged, fully, directly, with the kind of eye contact that made people feel like the only person in the room, and the room responded the way rooms always respond to someone who isn't trying. Director Park materialized first. Then Chairwoman Song. Then a cluster of people Ji-hoon recognized from the international investment sector, drawn over by some social current he couldn't trace back to its source. He stayed close. Hand at the small of her back, light, professional, the expected posture of a husband at a public event. Except that he became aware, somewhere around the 3rd conversation, that he was pressing slightly firmer than light. That his hand had moved without instruction. He made himself ease off. It didn't entirely take. "Your wife is remarkable," Seo-yoon said, appearing at his elbow with a champagne flute and the evaluating look of a man who trafficked in rare things and had just spotted one. "The way she holds a room." "Where did you find her?" "We met through mutual connections," Ji-hoon said. Seo-yoon's eyes tracked Arya across the space, unhurried, openly admiring. "She's not like the women you usually bring to these things, Ji-hoon. There's something, I don't know, real about her." Ji-hoon said nothing. His jaw had tightened. "If things were different," Seo-yoon began, laughing like it was a joke. "They aren't," Ji-hoon said. The laugh faded. Seo-yoon looked at him with mild surprise, then raised his glass in a small concession and moved on. Ji-hoon stood very still. Across the room, Arya was laughing at something a foundation director had said, genuinely, her head tilting back slightly, one hand rising briefly to her collarbone. The emerald of her dress caught the light. 3 men in her immediate vicinity had oriented themselves toward her without, he suspected, realizing they'd done it. Something moved through his chest. Dark and unfamiliar and entirely unwelcome. He recognized it the way you recognize a sound you've only heard described, not from memory, but from the shape of the damage it left behind. He looked away. Picked up a glass from a passing tray. Told himself it was nothing. The glass was empty before he noticed he'd finished it. It started with a business card. Ji-hoon saw it happen from across the room at the tail end of the gala. Marcus Osei, American venture capitalist, Lagos-born, Seoul-based, the kind of man who moved through rooms with the easy confidence of someone who had never needed to manufacture it. He'd approached Arya near the terrace doors, said something that made her smile, and produced a card from his inside pocket with a casualness that suggested he'd been looking for the right moment all evening. Arya had taken it. She hadn't thrown it away. Ji-hoon knew this because he'd noticed, which was already a problem, and because 3 days later she mentioned, over coffee she was making when he happened to be in the kitchen, that she was meeting a contact from the gala on Thursday. Professional? He asked, before he could decide not to. She looked up from her mug. Yes, she said simply, and returned to her coffee. He nodded. Left the kitchen. Opened his laptop and did 45 minutes of work he couldn't recall afterward. Thursday arrived. He told himself he had a meeting nearby. This was true. He rescheduled it to the afternoon, which made it adjacent to True, and he told his driver to take the long route through Cheongdam, which put them within a 2-block radius of the cafe where, according to a very brief piece of information he'd extracted from a very brief conversation with Mrs. Park about Arya's Thursday schedule, she would be at 11. He did not go in. He sat in the back of the car with his laptop open and a call he wasn't fully present for playing through his earpiece, and he watched the entrance of a glass-fronted cafe on a street he had no professional reason to be on. Arya arrived 4 minutes early. Marcus arrived 2 minutes after that, and Ji-hoon watched him hold the door open, not perfunctorily, but with a particular attentiveness that suggested he'd been thinking about this meeting since he handed over the card. Ji-hoon's driver said nothing. The call ended. Ji-hoon removed his earpiece and sat in silence, watching the cafe through tinted glass, aware with some cold and clinical part of his mind that what he was doing was irrational. Unnecessary. A direct violation of Clause 7 of the contract he had written, the contract he had presented as the governing document of an arrangement he described as clean. He stayed for 40 minutes. When Arya emerged, she was laughing at something Marcus had said, that easy, unguarded laugh he'd first seen at the gala, the one that made the people around her lean in like a reflex. Marcus said something else at the door. She shook her head, still smiling, said something brief, and walked toward the street to hail a cab. She didn't look back. Marcus watched her go with the expression of a man already composing a reason to reach out again. Ji-hoon looked away before he could finish cataloging it. Back to the office, he said. He was in a meeting by 2 o'clock. By 4, he had reviewed 3 contracts, responded to 11 emails, and made a decision about a Singapore acquisition he'd been deliberating for 6 weeks. He was efficient. He was focused. He was fine. At 7, Arya came home, set her bag by the entrance, and walked into the kitchen where he was standing with a glass of water and no convincing reason to be there. Good meeting, he asked. She opened the refrigerator. Productive. Marcus is looking at a tech logistics company in Nairobi. He wanted my read on the East African market. And you gave it to him. That's generally how conversations work. She pulled out leftover rice, glanced at him sideways. Why? I'm not asking anything. You're standing in the kitchen at 7 p.m. holding a glass of water and asking about my meetings. You never ask about my meetings. He had nothing for that. She studied him for a moment, and he recognized the look, the same one she'd turned on the contract clause she didn't like, precise and unhurried, taking the measure of something that didn't quite add up. Then she let it go. She put the rice on. Moved around the kitchen with the easy familiarity she'd gradually built in a space he'd always moved through like a waiting room. "He asked me to dinner," she said, not looking at him. "I said no. I don't think it would be appropriate, given the arrangement." Ji-hoon set down his glass carefully. "You don't have to decline things on my account," he said. Rule 7. "I know the rules, Ji-hoon." She glanced over her shoulder. "I wrote my initials next to all of them." She turned back to the stove. He left the kitchen before the silence could say anything he wasn't ready to hear. It began with a cancelled dinner. Marcus had reached out again, a group dinner this time, 6 people, entirely professional, a curator from the National Museum of Korea and 2 other investors Arya had mentioned wanting to connect with. She'd mentioned it in passing on a Tuesday, the way she mentioned most things, cleanly and without ceremony, and Ji-hoon had said that's fine without looking up from his laptop. By Thursday evening he'd read Marcus Osei's professional profile 3 times, which was 2 more times than any due diligence on the man professionally required. He was in his study when she knocked. "I'm heading out," she said from the doorway, already in her coat. Deep burgundy. The same color as the dress she'd worn to their first meeting, which he noticed and wished he hadn't. "I shouldn't be late." "Fine." She didn't move. He looked up. "You've been strange all week," she said. "I've been working." "You've been working and strange." She leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, studying him with that particular quality of attention that always made him feel like a document she was reviewing for inconsistencies. "What is it?" "Nothing." Ji-hoon. "Have a good evening, Arya." Something shifted in her expression. Not anger, something more considered than that. She stepped fully into the room, which she rarely did, and closed the door behind her, which she never did. "Say it," she said quietly. "Whatever it is. Just say it." "There's nothing to say. You watched me leave on Tuesday from the window. I saw your reflection in the glass of the building across the street." The room went very still. He set down his pen. "That's..." "Don't," she said, and her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. Something that had been building quietly for weeks and had apparently chosen tonight to surface. "Don't tell me it was nothing. Don't tell me you were passing by. I am not asking for a confession, Ji-hoon, I'm asking you to stop pretending." "I'm not pretending anything." "You are." She took a breath. "You have been pretending since the gala. You watch me across every room we're in together and then look away the second I notice. You ask questions you frame as not asking. You stood in the kitchen for 20 minutes on a Thursday holding a glass of water." A pause. "You're a liar." The word landed clean and precise, like she'd placed it rather than thrown it. "I wrote the contract," he said. "I know you did." Rule 7. No interference. "I know what Rule 7 says." "Then you know I haven't. You followed me, Ji-hoon." Her voice didn't rise. That almost made it worse. "You don't get to cite the contract you violated to prove you haven't violated it." He stood up. He didn't intend to. His body made the decision before his mind caught up, and now he was standing behind his desk with nowhere to direct the thing moving through his chest, that dark, unwieldy thing that had been building since an emerald dress caught the light 3 weeks ago and hadn't stopped since. "What do you want me to say?" His voice came out lower than intended. The truth would be a reasonable place to start. "The truth." He said it like he was testing the weight of it. "The truth is that I watched Marcus hold a door open for you and I wanted to." He stopped. "Wanted to what?" The silence stretched. "Something unreasonable," he said. Tell me. Arya. Tell me. He looked at her directly for the first time all week. I wanted to lock you in this penthouse, he said. So no one else could, so you couldn't. He stopped again. Set his jaw. I'm aware of how that sounds. She didn't flinch. Didn't look away. It sounds like possession, she said quietly. Not caring. Possession. I know the difference. Do you? She tilted her head, and her voice was careful now, picking through something fragile. Because caring would look like asking me how I am. Caring would look like learning something about me beyond what your investigator filed in a report. Caring doesn't pace outside closed doors, Ji-hoon. It knocks. He had nothing. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the language that had always been available to him, clean, efficient, contractual, was entirely gone. She picked up her bag from where she'd set it by the door. I'm going to dinner, she said. Not because I want to hurt you. But because I am a person, not a variable in your arrangement, and I will not shrink myself to make your jealousy more comfortable. She opened the door. When I get back, she said, not turning around, I think we should talk. Actually talk. Not negotiate. The door closed. Ji-hoon stood in the silence of his study for a long time. Then he sat down, slowly, and looked at the contract still open on the corner of his desk, Rule 7 printed clearly in black ink, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had just been shown the precise shape of his own failing, that he had broken it long before Thursday. His father's birthday was the kind of event that functioned less as a celebration and more as a census, a yearly accounting of who was present, who was rising, and who had slipped since the last one. Ji-hoon had attended every year with the same expression he brought to earnings calls. Prepared. Unreadable. Revealing nothing that could be used later. This year was different, and he knew it before they arrived. Arya wore black. Simple, architectural, a dress that asked nothing of the room and received everything from it anyway. She'd pinned her hair up, and the line of her neck above the neckline of her gown did something to the air around him that he'd stopped pretending not to notice. They'd talked, after the night she came home from dinner. Actually talked, the way she'd asked for, not a negotiation, not a briefing, but something halting and imprecise and unfamiliar that left him feeling strangely lighter and more exposed than any conversation he could remember. She hadn't asked him to feel less. She'd asked him to be honest about what he felt, which was harder. He was still learning the difference. In the car she was quiet, but not the distant kind of quiet. The thinking kind. Her fingers rested loosely in her lap and she looked out at the city with an expression he'd slowly, over weeks, begun to be able to read. Something was on her mind. He didn't ask. Not yet. The party occupied the entire top floor of his father's preferred hotel, and within 20 minutes of arriving, Ji-hoon understood why people described certain rooms as alive. The space buzzed with the specific energy of souls elite performing ease for each other, laughter calibrated to carry, handshakes held a beat too long, everyone watching everyone while appearing to watch no one. Arya moved through it the way she always did, beside him and entirely herself. His grandmother found her first. Then 3 of his father's oldest business partners. Then a group of younger executives who'd clearly heard things and wanted to form their own opinions. Ji-hoon stayed close, greeted people, said what needed to be said, and noticed, with a precision that had become involuntary, every face that turned toward his wife and every moment she smiled. His father found him near the bar at the halfway point of the evening. She's good for you, the older man said, not looking at him, watching the room. It's an arrangement. I know what it is. His father's voice was dry. I'm telling you what I see. Ji-hoon said nothing. His father moved on. The dancing began at 9. A live quartet. The floor opened. He found Arya at the edge of the room, champagne glass in hand, watching the dancers with an expression that was almost wistful. "Dance with me," he said. She looked at him. "That wasn't in the brief." "I'm not briefing you. I'm asking." A beat. Something moved through her eyes. She handed her glass to a passing waiter and let him lead her onto the floor. She danced the way she did everything, naturally, without performing it. His hand at her waist. Her hand at his shoulder. Close enough that he could catch the scent of her perfume, something warm and understated that he'd stopped pretending not to notice weeks ago. They moved in silence for a moment. Then he said it. Not because he'd planned to. Not because the timing was strategic or the setting was ideal or he'd found the right configuration of words. But because she was in his arms and the music was slow and he had run out of ways to carry it quietly. "I love you." She stilled. Not stopped, they kept moving, but something in her went very still. "Ji-hoon. I know what the contract says. I know what I built and what I told you it was." His voice was low. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know." She pulled back slightly to look at him. And the expression on her face was the one he'd feared, not cold, not angry, but careful. The look of someone holding something fragile and deciding. "I got a call," she said quietly. "Last week. A firm in London. Senior analyst position. It's everything I came to Korea to work toward." The music continued. His hand stayed at her waist. "When?" he managed. "The contract ends in 6 weeks. They want me the week after." The floor moved beneath him. Or felt like it did. "Arya. You said you love me," she said softly, and her eyes were steady and sad and honest. "But Ji-hoon, I need you to ask yourself something. When you imagine me staying, is it because you want me to be happy?" Ji-hoon stood at the center of the room, surrounded by music and movement and the low hum of 100 conversations, completely alone in a way that had nothing to do with proximity. His father's birthday continued around him. He didn't move for a long time. He didn't call her that night. He didn't call her the next morning either, though he picked up his phone twice before putting it back down with the particular self-discipline of a man who had spent 32 years mistaking control for strength and was only now beginning to understand the difference. Arya moved through the penthouse in the days that followed with the same quiet composure she'd brought to everything, packing gradually, without ceremony, a box here, a cleared shelf there. She was courteous. He was courteous. They were two people being extraordinarily careful with each other in the specific way of those who understood that one wrong word could crack something that was already fracturing. She left on a Tuesday. Mrs. Park helped with the bags. Ji-hoon stood in the entryway and told her the settlement had been transferred, all documentation was in order, and that he hoped London was everything she'd worked for. She looked at him for a moment. "Take care of yourself, Ji-hoon," she said. "Not the company. Yourself." Then she was gone. The penthouse, which had always been large, became enormous. He lasted 9 days before his grandmother called. Not to comfort him, she wasn't built for comfort in the conventional sense. She called to tell him, in the direct and unhurried way she approached most truths, that he looked like a man who had finally broken something he couldn't buy back, and that she knew a doctor. "A therapist," she said. "Not a psychiatrist. A therapist. There is a difference and you are educated enough to know it. I don't need." "You followed that woman to a cafe," his grandmother said. "And lost her anyway. You need." He went. Dr. Yoon's office was in Mapo, which Ji-hoon appreciated for its distance from his professional world. The room was modest. 2 chairs. A window with a view of nothing dramatic. Dr. Yoon herself was a woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses she never seemed to actually use and the particular patience of someone who had heard most things and been surprised by very few of them. The first session, Ji-hoon spoke for 4 minutes and spent the remaining 50 trying to explain why he had nothing further to add. Dr. Yoon seemed to find this informative. "What did she say to you?" she asked, near the end. "The last real thing." He thought of the dance floor. The music still moving around them. Arya's eyes, steady and sad and honest. "She asked me whether I wanted her to be happy," he said, "or whether I just couldn't bear the thought of someone else being near her." "And which was it?" The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. "Both," he said finally. "At the time." Dr. Yoon nodded, wrote something brief, and said, "Then that's where we'll start." The months that followed were the most uncomfortable of his adult life, which was considerable given that he had restructured a failing empire at 29, negotiated with men twice his age who'd wanted him to fail, and once sat across a table from his own father and refused to blink for 40 minutes. None of that had required this. This required him to sit in a modest chair in Mapo twice a week and be wrong, out loud, with no leverage and no exit strategy. To trace the architecture of his own behavior backward, the contracts he'd written for human relationships, the efficiency he'd used as a wall, the difference between protecting something and possessing it, which turned out to be enormous and which he had spent his entire life collapsing into the same category. He learned things about himself he would not have chosen to learn. That the coldness he'd perfected wasn't strength. It was a structure he'd built at 17 when his mother left and his father responded by working harder, and Ji-hoon had looked at both of them and concluded, with the devastating logic of an adolescent, that feeling things led only to wreckage. That jealousy, in his case, had nothing to do with Arya and everything to do with the terror of something mattering enough to lose. That wanting to lock someone in a penthouse was not love. It was fear wearing love's clothing. He sat with all of it. He stopped dismissing it. Slowly, not linearly, not without weeks where he reverted completely and had to begin again, he started to practice different things. He called his father and asked, instead of reported. He told his grandmother he missed her, which he had always felt and never said. He let a deal fall through in November because the terms were wrong, and instead of engineering a workaround he told his team simply, "It wasn't right, let it go." They looked at him like he'd changed. He supposed he had. He texted Arya once, in October. Nothing that required a response. Just, "I hope London is giving you what you went for." She replied 3 hours later, "It's a good city." Cold, but honest. He read it 4 times. Wrote 6 different responses. Sent none of them. Not yet. He was learning, slowly and with great difficulty, that timing was not the same as control. That waiting without agenda was its own kind of courage. That you could not ask someone to trust your transformation and then rush the evidence. He went back to Dr. Yoon's office on a gray Thursday in December and sat down and said, without being prompted, "I think I'm ready to talk about what I actually want. Not what I'm afraid of losing. What I actually want." Dr. Yoon set down her pen. "Good," she said. "Let's hear it." He didn't plan Jeju. That was the first thing, the thing that would have mattered to the man he'd been a year ago, the man who planned everything down to its smallest variable and called it efficiency. The trip emerged from a conversation with his grandmother in late February, who mentioned offhandedly that she was spending a week at the family's old property on the island and that the camellia trees were blooming and that it seemed a shame for the house to be so empty. Ji-hoon heard himself say he'd come. His grandmother's pause lasted exactly long enough to tell him she understood this was not really about the camellias. He flew down on a Friday. The property sat on the southern coast, old stone walls and a garden that had been tended by the same family for 3 generations. With a view of the sea that his grandmother described as the only thing in her life that had never disappointed her. Ji-hoon walked the grounds that first evening and understood what she meant. There was something about the scale of the water, unhurried, indifferent, vast, that made the things he'd been carrying feel briefly proportionate. He called Arya on Saturday morning. He hadn't told her he was going to. He'd thought about it the night before, set the phone down, thought about it again, and then at some point between midnight and sleep made the quiet decision that the version of himself he was trying to become would make the call, and the version he was leaving behind would find a reason not to. She answered on the third ring. Ji-hoon. Not surprised exactly. More like someone who had been expecting a letter and was noting its arrival. I'm in Jeju, he said. I wanted to hear your voice. A pause. The sound of London in the background, traffic, distance, a life she'd built without him. How is it? She asked. Quiet. My grandmother's here. The garden is. He stopped, looked out at the camellias heavy with pink bloom along the stone wall. It's beautiful, actually. I don't think I've ever noticed before. Another pause. Softer this time. You sound different, she said. I've been told that. Different how? Not cautious, genuinely curious. Slower, he said. I think. Less, I don't know. Less braced. She was quiet for a moment. He let the silence be what it was instead of filling it. I'm glad, she said finally, and he could hear that she meant it, which was both better and harder than he'd prepared for. Arya. He moved to the low stone wall at the garden's edge and sat down, the sea wind pulling at his jacket. I want to say something, and I need you to know before I say it that I'm not saying it to ask you for anything. I'm not calling to negotiate. Okay. I know what I did wrong. Not in the abstract, specifically. I know that what I called caring was control. I know I treated your presence in my life like an acquisition I needed to protect rather than a person I needed to know. He paused. Kept going. I know that you made the right decision. To leave. To go to London. And I know that whatever I felt, whatever I still feel, that's mine to carry. It's not yours to manage. The sea moved below. A bird crossed the pale morning sky. Ji-hoon. I'm not finished, he said quietly. I want you to be happy. I mean that without condition. If London is it, if the work is right and the life is right and there's someone there who, he stopped. Steadied. If that's where your life is, then I want that for you. Not because I've stopped feeling what I feel. But because I finally understand that loving someone and holding them are not the same thing. And I spent a long time believing they were. The silence that followed was the longest of the conversation. When she spoke, her voice was careful and quiet and not entirely steady. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. I've been practicing. A sound that might have been a small, surprised laugh. I know. Your grandmother told me. He blinked. She called you? In November. She said, and I'm quoting directly, the boy is trying. I thought you should know. Ji-hoon looked toward the house, where his grandmother was almost certainly sitting with her morning tea and absolutely no remorse. Of course she did, he said. She also said the camellia garden is the best place on earth to think clearly. She's not wrong. Another silence. Different from the others, not weighted, not cautious. Something more like two people standing in the same place for the first time in a long time, testing the ground. I haven't stopped thinking about you, Arya said. I want you to know that too. Not as information you can use. Just, because it's true. He closed his eyes briefly. Okay, he said. Okay, she echoed. The sea continued below. The camellias held their bloom against the stone wall, patient and unhurried, unbothered by the winter that had preceded them. Ji-hoon sat with the weight of everything unsaid and unsettled and unresolved, and found, carefully, that he could bear it. That bearing it without grasping was something he'd learned, slowly, to do. "Come see the garden," he said. "When you're ready. No agenda. Just, come see it." A long pause. "Maybe," she said. It was the most honest maybe he'd ever been given. He held it like it was enough. For now, it was. She came in April. No announcement beyond a single text sent the evening before. "I land at 11. Don't send a car. I want to find my own way there." He read it standing in the kitchen of his grandmother's house on Jeju, where he'd been spending more weekends than he could professionally justify and had stopped trying to. He set the phone down. Looked out at the garden, where the camellias had given way to something softer, the first suggestions of spring working their way through the old stone beds. He didn't send a car. She arrived at 12:30, a single bag over her shoulder, wearing a light jacket against the island wind, and when she came through the garden gate and saw him standing on the path she stopped for a moment, just a moment, like someone confirming that the thing they'd been imagining was real. He didn't move toward her. He'd learned that too. She crossed the distance herself, and when she reached him she looked at his face with the careful, unhurried attention she'd always given to things that mattered, reading him the way she'd read the contract on that first night, thoroughly, without rushing, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy something she'd been uncertain about. "You look like yourself," she said. "A different self. But yours. I've been told I'm slower now." "Slower is good." The corner of her mouth moved. "I liked you. Even then. I want you to know that. It wasn't all." "I know," he said. "I know it wasn't." His grandmother appeared in the doorway of the house behind them, assessed the situation with one practiced look, and announced that lunch was ready and that she would not be holding it for sentiment. They spent 3 days on the island. Not performing anything. Not negotiating. Walking the coastal paths in the mornings, eating his grandmother's cooking, sitting in the garden in the late afternoons when the light went gold and the sea turned the color of old glass. Talking, the kind of talking that had no agenda, that circled back and contradicted itself and left things unresolved for hours before resolving them quietly, sideways, without announcement. She told him about London. The work, which was good. The city, which was exactly as cold and honest as she described. The particular loneliness of building a life in a place that doesn't yet know your name, which she'd navigated with the same self-possession she brought to everything and which had cost her more than she'd admitted to anyone. He told her about therapy. About Dr. Yoon and the modest chair and the months of being wrong out loud. About his mother, which he had never told anyone, and which came out on the second evening on the garden wall with the sea below and the stars beginning and her sitting close enough that he could feel the warmth of her arm near his. She didn't fill the silence after. She just stayed in it with him. That, he thought, was everything. On the third morning he brought out the contract. He'd carried it from Seoul in a plain envelope, which his grandmother had looked at without comment when she saw him pack it. The pages were crisp still, formal, every clause intact. 2 signatures at the bottom. Bold and unhurried, both of them. They were sitting in the garden. The sea visible beyond the wall. The spring light coming through the old trees at an angle that made everything look considered. He set it on the low stone table between them. Arya looked at it for a moment without speaking. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what it would mean to start without one." She looked up. "No clauses," he said. "No rules. No settlement structure. No exit terms." He held her gaze. "Just asking you. Plainly. If you want to try." She was quiet for a long time. Then she reached across and picked up the contract, and without ceremony or drama she folded it once, and then again, and then held it over the small iron candle lantern sitting at the table's edge, and let the corner catch. They watched it burn together. The pages curling, the clauses dissolving, the signatures last to go, both of them, unhurried, exactly as they'd been written. When the ash had settled, she set the lantern down and looked at him. "Ask me," she said. "Arya and George." His voice was steady. "Not for appearances. Not for the company. Not because I'm afraid of losing you or because I can't bear the thought of anyone else near you." He paused. "Because you are the most honest person I have ever sat across a table from, and I would like, for the rest of my life, to keep learning what that means." A breath. "Will you marry me?" The garden was very quiet. The sea moved below. "Yes," she said. "But I have one condition." He felt something ease open in his chest. "Of course you do." "No contracts." "No contracts," he agreed. She smiled then, not the composed, careful smile she'd worn through galas and dinners and 1,000 public appearances, but the real one, the unguarded one, the one he'd first seen aimed at his grandmother and had wanted, quietly and without knowing how to say so, ever since. His grandmother married them in the garden 3 days later. No guests beyond the three of them and Mrs. Park, who cried quietly into a handkerchief and denied it afterward. No officiant beyond his grandmother, who had decided she had the authority and dared anyone to disagree. Arya wore the color of the camellias, soft ivory, simple, a dress she'd found in a small shop in the village and chosen herself with no stylist and no brief. She was more beautiful than she'd been the first time. He said his vows without notes. Without strategy. Without anything between the words and what he meant by them. She said hers looking directly at him, steady and clear and entirely herself, the way she had always been from the moment she sat across from him in a private dining room and read a contract like it was a negotiation between equals. Because it had been. Because she had always known that. Afterward his grandmother served tea in the garden and said only, "Finally," and refused to elaborate. The sea was very blue. The old stone walls held the light the way they always had, patient and unhurried, built to last. Ji-hoon held his wife's hand, not to keep her, not to claim her, but because she was there and she had chosen to be, and he understood now, fully, what a different thing that was. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. The garden was quiet. It was enough. It was everything. 1 year later, Arya still made too much coffee. It was the thing he'd noticed first, in those early sterile weeks of parallel lives and careful distances, the way she'd brew a full pot in the morning and drink half and leave the rest sitting warm on the counter, as if she were always expecting company or simply refused to scale her habits down to solitude. He drank the second half now. She knew. She'd never said anything about it, but one morning in their 3rd month back in Seoul he'd come into the kitchen to find the pot already made and 2 mugs set out on the counter, and when he looked at her she was reading something at the table and didn't look up, and that was that. It was the smallest thing. It was not a small thing. They'd returned to Seoul in May, to a different apartment, smaller than the penthouse, which had always been a monument to curated emptiness rather than a place anyone actually lived. Arya had found it. 8th floor, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook in and windows that let in the kind of light that made a room feel inhabited rather than displayed. She'd asked his opinion on 3 things during the search. He'd given it without addendum or override. She'd chosen the apartment anyway and he'd said good choice and meant it without remainder. Dr. Yoon had noted this as progress. He'd noted it as Tuesday. Arya consulted now, her own firm, small and precise and growing steadily, East African market strategy, international business development, the work she'd gone to London to find and had ultimately brought back with her to Seoul, where it turned out there was considerable appetite for exactly what she knew. She worked from the 2nd bedroom most mornings, door open, music low, occasionally reading something aloud to herself in the particular way she had when she was testing whether an argument held. He'd learned to find this sound in any room. He'd learned a lot of things. That she took her tea strong and her opinions stronger. That she laughed most genuinely at things that weren't trying to be funny. That she carried homesickness for Nairobi the way people carry old photographs, privately, carefully, taking it out sometimes in the evenings when she'd call her mother and speak in a voice that was softer than any he heard otherwise, a version of her that existed before Korea and contracts in him. He was learning to love all of it, not just the parts that were legible to him. That, Dr. Yoon had told him, was the actual work. His grandmother visited in August. She arrived with opinions about the apartment, mostly positive, delivered as neutral observation, and spent 3 days cooking things that had no recipe and eating dinner with them at a table that was never quite large enough, which seemed to please her immensely. On her last evening she sat in the kitchen with Arya long after Ji-hoon had cleared the dishes, and he could hear them from the other room, his grandmother's low, deliberate cadence, Arya's warmer one, laughter moving between them with the ease of people who had decided to know each other and had done so without waiting for permission. He stood in the doorway for a moment without announcing himself. His grandmother caught his eye across the room and said nothing, which from her was as close to sentiment as it came. He went back to the living room and let them have it. On a Wednesday evening in September, Arya came home from a client meeting and found him in the kitchen making dinner, something he'd been slowly, with considerable trial and error and one memorable incident involving gochujang, learning to do. She set her bag down. Looked at the counter, the open cookbooks, the state of the kitchen, which was considerable. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Unclear," he said. "Optimistic." She came and stood beside him and looked at the pan and made a small sound that was not quite confidence. "Move," she said. "I'll fix it. I had a method. You had intentions." She nudged him gently aside with her shoulder. "There's a difference." He let her take over. Stood close, watching her work, the easy competence of her hands, the way she tasted something and adjusted without measuring, the way she hummed very quietly when she thought no one was listening. He was always listening. "Ji-hoon," she said, not looking up from the pan. "Yes." "Stop looking at me like that in the kitchen. It's distracting." "Like what?" She glanced at him sideways. The real smile. The unguarded one. "Like you're still surprised I stayed." He considered denying it. "I'm working on it," he said. She turned back to the stove. "Take your time," she said softly. "We're not on a clock anymore." Outside, Seoul moved through its evening, the city indifferent and enormous and alive, the way it always was, the way it would always be. The Han River somewhere below, catching the last of the light. Inside, the kitchen was warm. The coffee pot sat ready for morning. 2 mugs on the counter. Both of them.